Hey everyone, welcome to the Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt. And today, you're going to learn more about a company that you may have used this week. You may have actually used today. And we are going to learn a little bit more about the inner workings of that organization. And that's a company known as Netflix. And today I am joined by Sergio Ezama. Sergio is the Chief Talent Officer at Netflix, a role that he's been in for the past several years. And I'm excited to learn more about the inner workings of a company and an organization that I use pretty regularly, as I imagine most of you do as well. So, Sergio, welcome to the podcast. I'd love to have you open with an introduction for our audience.
Yeah, well, first of all, Lars, thank you very much for watching Netflix in the first place and for having me in your show. Well, I'm Sergio. I've been in Netflix for 2 years and 4 months, give or take. Prior to that, really long stint in PepsiCo. As you can tell, I do not come from the US. I come from Spain. That's why I have this beautiful accent of mine. I'm really happy to share with you everything that I've learned about Netflix that might be of use for many of you listening to this.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, you spent quite a bit of time, I think just over 20 years at PepsiCo before joining Netflix. Two very different companies, two very different industries. What was that transition like for you, particularly after 20 years in a variety of roles at PepsiCo, but long tenured career there, and then you move over to a high growth company that is really an entertainment company.
Yeah.
And a technology company. So you kind of have two industries now. What was that transition like for you?
I'd love to say that it was a seamless transition, but reality is that it was a really, really hard transition. The first realization is that you don't know anything. Like after 20 years in CPG, one company, you moved into Netflix, which is new to you. You are at the convergence of two very different industries, tech and entertainment. And then you are surrounded by people and an organization you need to really learn fast about. So that took its time. It was a difficult year of it all. So it was the year of the tech correction, or the Netflix correction also, as it was named. So it was a very unusual year for Netflix. And on top of that, we even faced things like a co-CEO transition. Reed Hastings, founder of the company, became executive chairman. So a variety of things that typically will happen over a period of time, they happened during my first year. And then it was my first CHRO. So there are things that you just learn when you are in the seat. Nothing prepares you for. And that added a bit to the complexity of the transition. Now, I'm really happy those days are behind. And after a couple of years now, I'm truly enjoying the challenge.
Yeah. Well, what originally drew you to Netflix, right? I mean, it was, you mentioned having an opportunity to have your first CHRO role, shifting industries. What were elements? Imagine you could have done a lot of things at that point in your career. You chose to join Netflix. What was it about the opportunity that you found so compelling?
So it's Netflix in the first place.
Yeah.
Hopefully we all can relate to the brand and the shows, which is it's a very compelling organization and what they do. Also, I find very intellectually very stimulating to be part of how that industry is going to transform. So CPG is a much more established industry. Streaming is a very new industry, just 26 years old, and we have these entertainment legacy companies and the big tech companies all going after the size of the prize. So that is, from an intellectual standpoint, very, very stimulating to me. Netflix also has a bit of a, I would say, unique way of looking at the people agenda, which also, caught my attention. And probably the last one, it might be a bit personal, is after 20 years in one place and being reasonably successful, almost that you want to prove to yourself that you can do it elsewhere. And I couldn't think of any place more different than Pepsi and CPG than Netflix. And that was the last, I guess, argument that won the decision. That's why I'm here.
Yeah. Well, take us, imagine most of our audience is familiar with Netflix as a company, but may not be familiar with, the size and structure of the organization. Can you give us an overview of the kind of employee headcount footprint, if you will, and the businesses, and then maybe a window into how your people team is structured to support that?
So as many of you know, we are a global organization. We have three business verticals. We have film, we have TV, and then we have games. But we deliver all that through a single brand, a single platform, and a single P&L, which means that we are organized in a functional organization. From a headcount perspective, Netflix is a fairly efficient organization. We have around 13,000 associates around the world. To support those people, my team, which has give or take 650 members, are organized in a very traditional, I guess, HR operating model where we lead with HR business partners aligned against the big businesses and functions. Those are supported by what we call GVPs. In other companies, that are called COEs, groups with a particular deep expertise, coming with the right strategy plans and tools for HRVPs to support the business. And then we have a really strong backbone in a team that we call Talent Experience Operations, that takes care of everything that is technology related and heavy transaction related. So that's how we are organized. But again, relative to most of our competitors and relative to our revenues and profits, we are a very small organization from a headcount standpoint.
Yeah. I want to come back to something you said earlier in our conversation about what drew you to Netflix, and that was their innovative people agenda. And I want to just come back to that comment, and I'd love for you to expand on that. Like, how would you describe the innovative people agenda at Netflix?
Yeah. So typically, when you look at the startups, they are already especially when they are in a forming stage, and the founder is very present, and they are typically very principles led. And they have little HR infrastructure, and they're able to remain agile and innovative and all that, because that is what requires to be a startup in a hyper-growth phase. But then when you move to be more of a grown-up organization, and then you have operations in many places, typically the HR agenda moves to be more like it is in other industries, where you drive consistency through processes and policies for the most part, because otherwise it's complicated to maintain a very common baseline of decision-making through many people leaders around the globe. So I think what I find fascinating of Netflix is that somehow they crack the code of becoming large enough without getting into all those processes, policies that we believe are counterintuitive to the type of talent that we attract to Netflix. So our opportunity statement, if you want, is how we can continue to grow while being always a very first principles-led type of organization. If we are able to have those very clear in mind, if we're able to provide data and insights at the scale to all people leaders, and we are able to keep accountability with seats, which is with managers and people leaders instead of the HR function, we do believe we have a shot at becoming the first large organization that does HR in a very, very different manner. Now, I don't think anyone has done it, and maybe we don't either. But again, as a professional challenge, it is fascinating. And if any company will give you the chance to try, I think that is Netflix.
Yeah. Look, I think, Netflix, even within the HR community, I mean, going back to the Patty McCord days and the, Netflix manifesto and the kind of performance driven, I think it's an organization that a lot of companies have looked to try to model building a performance-based organization on. And, some of them are successful, some haven't, but I think it's one of those companies that is often, looked at or used in the same vernacular as some of the other, FAANG or larger tech companies when it comes to, building progressive people teams. And, one of the things that Netflix has done that is always very unique is your comp philosophy.
Correct.
And I imagine, some of our audience may not be familiar with that unique comp philosophy. So I'd love to, get you to expand on that a little bit. Just talk a little bit about how Netflix approaches compensation, and how that's so different from how many other companies do.
Right. If you have read our culture memo, it has a very simple approach to talent, and basically it goes as, if you want to succeed in this industry, and you want to be the leader, you need the best talent, which seems obvious. You need to attract the best. And the best, by the way, they get developed by two very simple things. One is working around very complex topics and then getting a lot of feedback, which is another hallmark of how we run the organization. So to attract the best talent, you need to pay very competitively. And in our first decades operating as a business, we were competing against Google, Microsoft, Meta, so the companies with definitely deep pockets. So we need to be extremely aggressive in how we position ourselves. So we came up with our personal top of market philosophy. Our personal top of market philosophy has a couple of components. The first one is that all our compensation is delivered in cash. We do not have bonus schemes, with the exception of the sales teams in our ads business. And we do not have fixed long-term incentives as part of the pay mix. And we believe that is beautiful for two reasons. A, it gives the employee the ultimate flexibility. So depending on where you are in your life, are you buying a house? Are you saving for retirement? Are you paying through your kids' college or whatever you need? You can make this out of a cash base. And then for the company, is the ultimate simplicity. We do not need to manage 15 different compensation-related programs that you might argue yield little value. So that's one first component, all cash compensation. The second one is where we position ourselves, where we position Netflix in between the 75th and the 95th percentile. So out of it, all cash compensation, we are relatively speaking very competitive in where we are relative to competition. And then I guess the special sauce is how we determine comp. And we determine each of our personal top of market responding to three tests. So if my manager would be here, he would say, I determine Sergio's compensation through three questions. Question number one, how much money can Sergio get in a similar job in a similar company? So that one is relatively easy. You look at market. These are a few companies similar to Netflix, CHRO job. What range am I looking at? So easy enough. Second one becomes a bit more intriguing, which is, let's say Sergio comes and says that he want to leave. How much are we happy to pay to keep him? That's what we call pay to keep. Now, all of a sudden, looking at the range, my boss needs to think of my impact, of my potential, or the things I bring to Netflix, and that positions me within that range. And then the third test is, okay, hold on a minute. If Sergio would leave tomorrow, what would be the cost to replace him? Right? Cost to replace. But by answering those three tests, managers determine compensation on a yearly basis. We do that without any sort of traditional performance management process. We do not write objectives, we do not do ratings, we do not calibrate. So all that infrastructure that maybe is useful in other settings, we avoid, and we just put the accountability with managers, asking them to follow those three questions, which they can respond by being, again, first principles oriented and by having the right data. That's all they need.
Yeah. It's such an interesting and I think also common sense in a competitive talent market approach to compensation. But yeah, just fascinating. I think there are very few companies that take that stance, and it totally makes sense when you think about what you're trying to build and the competition for talent and the bar for talent in the markets where you're hiring. Right. So it was interesting to learn a little bit more about that. I want to, you've been in the role for a little over 2 years now. What are your? I want to take a moment to hit highlights and lowlights. So we'll do the lowlights second, but I want to hit the highlights first. Like when you look at what accomplishment, what project, what initiative, if you had to pick one thing that is on like your accomplishment list over your first couple of years that you're most proud of, what would that be?
Yeah, I don't think it's. I was raised in extreme humility, so I always have difficulties with with what I've done. I can definitely think of a couple of things that I think are unique and for Netflix, and where we should feel extremely proud. To me, the one that is always fascinating is the approach to feedback, where in many organizations, feedback is typically this thing that happens twice per year, or maybe once per year. It becomes this big event where, oh, my boss is going to give me feedback. And I always was intrigued by how Netflix claimed that feedback is like brushing your teeth. It happens on a daily basis. And I joined the organization, and it truly is something that transcends any program or any initiative. When last year we went through what was called the Netflix correction, which unfortunately led to some restructuring in the company, we were a bit afraid that we were going to lose some of it. This idea that when you're all of a sudden, restructuring and losing jobs, that people might become a bit more timid or more conservative because they might think I'm going to lose my job. And so we put a lot of effort to make sure that everyone understood that feedback as something that you provide on a daily basis, no matter who you are talking to, is a thing. And today, it is such a vivid thing in the organization. So I feel strongly about this one because it doesn't seem big when you talk about it, but when you've been in enough organizations, you've talked to enough HR professionals to understand how it happens in other places, and then you put that relative to Netflix, it is a magic thing. And it is at the core of why we can operate the way we operate. And maybe to add one more thing, over the last decade, 15 years, learning has moved to be more online, more social, more self-guided, which I think is a beautiful thing. I think it helps democratizing learning. At Netflix, we have taken a bit of a different approach. We are doing all that, but we are just opening a ranch in California, close to Reno. It's a beautiful place where we are doing all the school, in-class, immersive programs for our leaders, and we built our programs in trying to hit all the elements of this sentence that Reed gave us, which is, in this company, what we are trying to have is great business, great leaders, great human beings. How we can think of securing that, and we have created these beautiful programs that we deliver in a very unique set that I think, again, is very different from what many companies are doing these days, which is closing any sort of physical location to do training and move everything to self-guided, etc. We are going the other way around because we believe there is a lot of value to be extracted when you put people in a place and you're able to have these conversations with quality time and space.
Yeah. I mean, I think specifically around leadership development, certainly there's something that is you can't replicate in any virtual setting than that live, hands-on, and especially peer setting, right? If people are going through these programs with their peers, it's solidifying the relationships they have at that peer level. Now you're strengthening not just the individual leadership, but the kind of cohort of leadership and bringing more cohesion between them, particularly in areas where they might be in functional areas where the nature of their work might not have them interacting with each other. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, we use the case method. We write the Netflix cases, and these are cases where we've done well, and many cases where we failed. So also that is a beautiful thing because we use the case method to make sure we become also a learning organization. So it's less about the theory or what other companies do, is that too, but what we've done in the past that led to success or led to failure and what we can learn from it. So also you build that institutional know-how that over time, I think it pays dividends.
Yeah. Well, let's, not to stick with the theme of failure, but, we covered the highlights. We need balance. We've got to cover the low end as well. I mean, when you think about your most difficult moment at Netflix, what was that?
So I talked a bit about my first year. And there are a couple of forces at play. when you become part of an organization like Netflix and you have an important mandate, you're a very motivated player. You really want to show up fast that you can make an impact. So that drove probably a bit too much innovation in a year where the company was a bit in distress. Now, the fact that the company is in distress gives you also a bit of a window to do things. Now that there's no better platform to be built, things are happening, therefore you need to react, and that gives you the license to change. But probably in hindsight, I pushed maybe a bit too many things at the same time in a company that was not probably in the headspace to embrace all of them equally. You know? So I think I didn't calibrate properly that element. So that is a learning that I'm keeping with me. And the other one probably is when you're building foundations, you have very present this idea of, I want to build something that is experienced the same across. And that somehow that comes with some sense of uniformity in your designs. But now, with more tenure at Netflix, I'm coming to appreciate the vast differences between the two big building blocks in the company. If you think about it, we are a studio, and that is full of creative content executives, but also we are a heavy tech company, and that is full of very, very different profiles. These two set of people, they are motivated by different things, they behave very differently. Like they need to be managed also slightly differently. So now more and more I'm appreciating that nuance, and I'm constantly forcing myself to incorporate elements into the design of how we do talent, so it will speak to those both audiences. And maybe again going back to failures, maybe in the first year I was a bit tone deaf to those differences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting too, because you correctly point out, two different industries, two different profiles, two different set of expectations of what work is, right? And how work works. Yeah. And that is that's a fine line to thread, I think, when you're coming over new. And as you mentioned, I appreciate the humility in your answer, but also in that, I also appreciate pointing out that as a new CHRO, obviously you want to make an impact. You want to show you and your team's abilities and what you're able to do, and you want to have the CEO and the executive team feel great about the decision they made and bringing you on, and that can put a lot of pressure. Yes. That I think the challenge you face, I think, is not unique for first time heads of people, CHROs, chief, whatever the title might be, because you do want to make an impact. You want to show what you can do. Absolutely. And that can get you out, over your skis, so to speak. I want to kind of stick with that theme for a moment. You obviously, joining Netflix, it was your first time in the CHRO role. Certainly at PepsiCo, you had a lot of interaction with the executive teams there. But as a new CHRO, I think there's a lot of people in the industry right now that are moving into that role for the first time. Yeah. And, no matter how senior you were and how big of a company before moving into that position, it is different. The relationships you have is different. The way that your team and your employees and your leadership team and your board look at you as an individual and as a leader is different. And so I'd love for you to spend a moment looking back, especially in that first year. Were there any key takeaways in terms of, in particular, building your relationship with your CEO and building your relationship with your C-suite peers that you think might be valuable, learnings and advice for that next generation of heads of people who are, maybe going to be moving into that role for the first time in 2024?
Yeah, I think the way I see it, there are 2 or 3 ingredients that everyone would have in mind. And you are effective with any business leader I think if you do 3 things well. One, if you are business centric. I know this sounds very basic, but sometimes HR leads with HR a bit too much rather than understanding where the business is and where it's going. So being business centric, I think, is always the first ingredient. Being curious and not judgmental comes second, and very, very closely. I find sometimes that HR professionals they hold a curiosity and they're quick to develop a perspective. Probably in trying to prove their worth to a particular stakeholder. So that will be the second one. The third one is that like definitely you need to have a perspective and a point of view beyond your area of expertise. And that should lead to moments where you would agree with something and moments where you would say, I do not think that is a good idea and here's why. No? So those three things, being business-centric, being curious and having a point of view, I think are the key ingredients. The rest is contextual. The rest is when you land in a company, where is that company at that point in time? Who am I interacting with? What is important for them right now? And being able to adjust your style to be effective in that particular setting.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that perspective. And I think too, that latter point is important, and sometimes it's uncomfortable, right? As a people leader, your role is that of a truth teller. And that means sometimes you have to push back on your CEO or your C-suite peers. And that's not comfortable even for seasoned leaders, let alone somebody in that role for the first time. But it is important. That's part of your role. And I think, really working to build and establish that foundation of trust, with your CEO and your C-suite that allows you to move into that truth teller role in a more kind of natural way. Yeah. I want to ask you about a particular technology that certainly I think is front of mind for most of HR, let alone most of society right now, this generative AI. And I'm curious, like as a CHRO, Chief Talent Officer, how are you using generative AI tools specifically? Do you have a kind of strategy in your people roadmap for generative AI? Like, how are you thinking about these tools?
I think there are three different spheres within any organization where HR plays a role. The first one is how AI plays a role in how you make money. So for Netflix, we've been using AI and Gen AI for a while, so it's not a new thing. Now that the influx of new tools obviously gives you greater capabilities. So there is something around how you organize yourself to explode those capabilities in support of your business. So the organizational design, do I build these capabilities myself? Do I buy them? All that. So that's one sphere where we are heavily involved, working with our product and technology leaders. There is another big sphere, which is most of the tools that we have seen, all of us, there are huge productivity tools. And anyone in any job using a computer can benefit from them. So how you build that common baseline to use ChatGPT in a way that makes you way more productive. And then there's a third sphere, which is how are you going to use generative AI in HR or HR technology, which we are observing a little bit. Maybe I still have a few scars from when matching algorithms became very, very popular, and then many companies got in trouble to go a bit too fast with those tools without accounting for biases. So there are safe places, like for example using a Gen AI layer to gather data for multiple data sources and presenting that something to you in a very intuitive and pristine manner, rather than having people building Excel spreadsheets for you. So that is a safe environment. Or how you would visualize data and things like that. But things like applications in talent acquisition, for example, or internal job markets, I would be a bit careful given our recent history. But it's definitely something that we are paying a lot of attention to, because it can help us, first and foremost, it can help us in our goal to democratize people and data insights. So this idea of leaders will be able to get a lot of information and insight from their phones rather than by asking their HRBPs. And in doing that effectively, HRBPs can dedicate themselves to something of greater value add.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that framing. And I think it's, it's interesting where the space of, AI is not new. Generative AI is not new. I think the consumer grade applications, that's what's been so fundamentally different in 2023. And so going into 2024, I'm out of the prediction game. I'm no longer making predictions. So we'll see how this changes. But I think it's a huge, value add if you use it practically, right? It's not something where nothing you're going to get from generative AI is going to be turnkey.
Okay.
All of it you're going to have to validate, you're going to have to massage, but it can give you a running start on a lot of things that won't have you building from scratch. So it's it's very interesting. And Sergio, my next question for you is completely unfair.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to own that, right? I'm going to call that out before I even ask the question. But it would be wrong of me to be talking with the Chief Talent Officer at Netflix and not ask you your 3 favorite Netflix shows from the past year.
Oh, from the past year.
And yeah, I'll put a disclaimer, right? You probably love all the shows. You know, you're going to be welcome with crossed eyes in LA. Yeah. If I don't add that as well. So let's just say, yes, you love all shows, but the 3 favorites.
So let me see. I'm a big Stranger Things fan, and actually that was new to me. I came to Netflix not having seen the show, and then when season 4 was coming out, everyone was talking about it. So I you need to talk about shows in this job. So I spent the full weekend catching up season 1 to 4. With the help of a couple of good bottles of wine. But now I love it, and season 5 is coming. The first table read happened last week, so we're very excited about that. So that's number 1. I was gonna say Money Heist, but I don't think we have had a season this year. But there is a spin-off from Money Heist that is called Berlin. Berlin is one of the characters of the original show that is in preview for employees. So I've seen it already. And it's going to come out this December. So that is a really, really good one. And then another, and this is going to be a film now that I really liked, I saw last week, is Society of Snow from a Spanish director, Bayona. It's been in theaters already. It's going to come to the service now also in December. And I think it's a really nice movie, and I think it has a good shot at winning the one Oscar at least in the coming gala. So those 3.
Yeah. All right. Well, you heard it. You've got some tips, and I didn't even consider the perk of getting early access to new shows before they come out. So your answers may hit things that we don't even know about yet. So I'm excited to check these out. And Sergio, it's been a real pleasure, spending some time with you and getting to know more about your background and your work at Netflix. I want to leave you with the final question that we close every episode with, and that is, what is bringing you joy lately?
Well, that is easy. Those are my kids. My kids I have 2 kids, 13 and 10. Those are wonderful ages. And I just spent a week at home, which is very unusual. And now we are looking at 3 weeks in Spain together as a family, and, just making plans with them, all sort of activities, from going to museums to doing sports to visiting family. It just brings me joy. So I'll stay with that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I wishing you an amazing trip and holidays. I guess to timestamp this will run in 2024. We're recording this in late 2023 in December, just before the holidays. But I hope you enjoy the trip to Spain with your family. And I appreciate you making some time to spend with me and all of the redefiners out there to help us learn a little bit more about what you're building at Netflix.
Yeah, fantastic. It was all my pleasure, and it's been a lot of fun. So thank you, Lars, and happy holidays to you too.